The discovery beneath the cliffs in the spring of 1902, beneath the pale cliffs of Middle Egypt, the wind carried the dry hiss of sand and the rhythmic strikes of pickaxes. A British expedition was combing through the limestone terraces of Beni Hassan, searching not for gold, but for memory, the faint traces of lives long buried. Then, one of the workers' shovels hit something hard. It wasn't stone, it was clay, a massive sealed pot, half buried in the earth, its rounded body covered in silt hardened by centuries of silence. When the archaeologists lifted it free, they expected grain, perhaps ceremonial oil, maybe a funerary offering. But when they cracked the plaster seal, the air that escaped was ancient, heavy, dry, untouched by time. Inside, curled in a fetal position, lay a man. No wrappings, no inscriptions, no treasures. Just bones, folded carefully as though placed to sleep. The posture was intimate, deliberate, knees drawn, arms folded, head bowed. Whoever buried him had done so with purpose. Pot burials weren't unknown in Egypt, but for an adult, it was almost unheard of. Infants, yes, they were sometimes placed in clay jars to symbolize a return to the womb. But a grown man, that was something different. The vessel itself was enormous, nearly as tall as a man's chest. It had been sealed so perfectly that even the air inside felt preserved. There was no name carved, no text to tell who he was. The dig notes described him only as Middle Egypt, Old Kingdom, sealed pot burial. His body was transported to Britain labeled, measured, and stored. And then, forgotten. He would remain in a museum drawer for more than a century, his story silent, his secret sealed not by sand, but by time. No one then could have imagined that this anonymous worker, buried inside his own material, would one day redefine everything we thought we knew about Egypt's beginnings. The man in the jar decades passed before anyone opened that record again. By then, the bones had outlived the archaeologists who unearthed them. Stored at the University of Liverpool, the sealed pot man was a catalogue entry with a photograph and a short note. Nothing more. Then, in the early 2000s, when the world of archaeology met the age of genetics, a new question arose: could ancient DNA still survive in Egypt's dry, punishing heat? The answer, for decades, had been no. Mummification, sand and desert air destroyed every biological trace. Scientists had tried to extract DNA from royal tombs, even from Ramses himself, all failures. The heat had burned the code of life away. But inside that sealed pot, something remarkable had happened. The clay had done what stone coffins could not. It had created a microclimate, a small, stable world, cut off from oxygen and bacteria. The burial had become a natural laboratory. When researchers re-examined the remains, they found the enamel on his teeth intact, solid, smooth, untouched. And inside that enamel, tiny fragments of DNA had survived. It was poetic, a craftsman, perhaps a potter, buried within the very medium he shaped. Now, his own clay cocoon had preserved the essence of his being. His skeleton told its own story. The grooves on his joints, the wear on his wrists. Signs of repetition, precision, endurance. He had worked with his hands, spinning the wheel, shaping clay into form. His spine showed compression from hours bent over his craft. His fingers bore the faint curvature of constant shaping. He wasn't a noble or a priest. He was a worker, an artisan whose art had outlasted kings. And now his legacy wasn't a vessel, but his DNA, sealed in that same clay he once molded. After nearly 5,000 years, the man in the jar was about to speak again, not through hieroglyphs, but through the language written inside every cell of his body. The genome that rewrote history. It began with a single tooth. The research team, led by geneticists from the Francis Crick Institute and Liverpool John Moores University, worked in sterile silence. They wore full-body suits, face shields, and gloves, because even a single modern fingerprint could contaminate the ancient code. Inside a sealed chamber, they drilled into the molar and extracted microscopic dust. DNA frozen in time. It took months of sequencing. Fragments of genetic data appeared on computer screens, broken and incomplete, like shards of pottery. Each had to be cleaned, cross-checked, and reassembled. And slowly, the pattern emerged, a full human genome from nearly 5 millennia ago. It was the oldest Egyptian genome ever decoded. The moment the data aligned, the room fell into silence. No one spoke. They all knew what they had just witnessed. When the analysis came through, it stunned the entire field. The man from the pot didn't match modern Egyptians. His genetic map traced back to 2 regions, North Africa and the ancient Fertile Crescent in the lands we now call Iraq, Syria, and Iran. 80% of his DNA connected him to early African populations, 20% to Middle Eastern ancestry. That 20% changed everything. It meant that Egypt's earliest civilization wasn't isolated. It was already part of a network, a movement of ideas, genes, and technologies flowing along ancient trade routes long before pharaohs ruled. This was the first biological evidence that the cradle of Egypt was shared, that its builders were connected to a wider prehistoric world stretching across deserts and seas. He wasn't an invader, nor a foreigner. He was the bridge, the living proof of cultural fusion, a man whose very bloodline carried the story of migration, of human exchange that shaped the foundations of civilization itself. When his results were published, the headlines read, "Egypt's oldest DNA discovered." And it changes everything. But the truth was quieter, more haunting. Inside that man's tooth lay the evidence that Egypt's story began long before Egypt was born. Echoes from a sealed jar news of the discovery spread through universities, documentaries, and history channels. The man in the jar became a symbol, a humble worker who had preserved the genetic memory of an empire. For Egyptologists, the implications were staggering. For decades, textbooks taught that Egypt had developed in isolation, a miracle of the Nile, rising from the floodplain without outside help. But now DNA told another story. The pot burial man revealed that Egypt was never alone. It was part of a continuous human web, connected through movement, intermarriage, and trade. He was living proof that civilization was collaboration, not competition. That Africa and Asia had been exchanging people and ideas thousands of years before recorded history. The discovery also sparked a deeper kind of reflection. For all the monuments Egypt left behind, the pyramids, the temples, the colossal statues, none had spoken as truthfully as this man's silent remains. He wasn't a pharaoh or a god-king. He didn't build tombs for eternity. He worked with earth, shaping vessels that carried life and food. And in death, his vessel carried the story of humanity itself. Scientists called him the genetic dawn of Egypt. Writers called him the man who rewrote time. But perhaps the most powerful truth lay in the irony that a craftsman buried in clay would become the vessel of revelation for an entire civilization. Museums began to search their archives again, looking for other sealed burials, untouched remains that might hold similar secrets. If one jar could rewrite history, what might 100 reveal? Each new sample carried the same sense of awe, the feeling that the past wasn't gone, only waiting for us to learn how to listen. And so the man in the pot, the anonymous worker from 2600 BC, became something eternal, not through monument or myth, but through science. His DNA was a whisper that crossed 5,000 years to remind us that history isn't carved in stone, it's carried in flesh, buried in silence, and waiting, always, to be found. He shaped clay with his hands, and time shaped eternity around him. The man who built vessels to hold life became one himself, holding within his bones the story of who we are and where we began. When bloodlines remember the results from the sealed pot, man shook the academic world. For the first time, ancient DNA had turned the Nile into a timeline, not a legend. And in that sequence of code, in those long, silent strands that survived 5,000 years, scientists glimpsed something astonishing, the genetic map of humanity's earliest crossroads. His ancestry was not narrow, not pure, not isolated. It was a river with 2 tributaries, Africa and Mesopotamia, merging somewhere in the sands of prehistory. For generations, historians imagined Egypt as a miracle that emerged from the Nile alone, an African kingdom that rose in splendid isolation. But the pottery man's genome told another story, a story of movement. A story of ancient travelers, of forgotten migrations, of people who carried seeds, symbols, and language long before nations had names. The DNA carried echoes of the Fertile Crescent, the region that gave birth to Sumer, Akkad, and Babylon, the world's first urban civilizations. The same genetic markers that appeared in early Mesopotamian farmers appeared, faintly but unmistakably, in the bones of Egypt's earliest craftsmen. It meant that before pyramids rose, before cuneiform or hieroglyphs, humans had already been walking between these worlds, exchanging ideas, tools, and genes. Civilization wasn't born twice, it was born once, and it spread like fire. This idea, that the dawn of Egypt and the dawn of Sumer were connected by blood, was more than science. It was the return of a forgotten memory, encoded in flesh, hidden until technology could translate it. The pot that once sealed a man's body had, in a strange way, unsealed our collective past. The crossroads of origins archaeologists began re-examining every artifact through this new lens. What if Egypt's sudden rise, its architecture, writing, mathematics, wasn't an isolated explosion of genius, but part of a shared lineage of innovation stretching across deserts and seas? Ancient DNA from the pottery man aligned with patterns found in early Anatolian farmers, the same people who once migrated through the Levant and into Mesopotamia. These weren't conquerors, but settlers, traders, families who followed rivers and coastlines, carrying their culture like embers from one hearth to the next. Some may have followed the Red Sea corridor, moving along the eastern coast of Africa before turning west toward the Nile. Others may have come through Sinai, crossing into Lower Egypt as the desert climate shifted. Archaeologists compared his genome to remains found near Jericho, Uruk, and Byblos, and the overlap was undeniable. A portion of his ancestry carried the same alleles, small genetic markers that traced to those early Neolithic communities who first domesticated wheat, barley, and goats. It was as if the DNA itself whispered, "We were all neighbors once." But there was another layer, a deeper, older African signature. Geneticists found traces that linked him to prehistoric Nubian and Saharan populations, groups that thrived when the Sahara was still green, a land of lakes, grasslands, and rain. Before it became desert, that region had been alive, filled with hunters, herders, and builders of stone circles older than Stonehenge. When the climate changed and the green Sahara died, those people moved, many toward the Nile Valley, bringing with them their tools, their cattle, and their cosmology. Their blood became the lifeblood of early Egypt. So the pottery man wasn't just a link between Africa and the Middle East. He was the embodiment of both, a descendant of the Green Sahara and a cousin of Mesopotamia, standing at the intersection where human history first intertwined. And suddenly, the old question, was Egypt African or Near Eastern, felt meaningless. The truth was far more beautiful. Egypt was both, a fusion civilization born of many mothers. The hidden web of migrations, the revelation rippled outward. Museums began checking their archives for untouched remains. Geneticists began sampling mummies, skeletons, and even animal bones, looking for patterns of movement across ancient trade routes. Slowly, a map began to form. Lines of ancestry traced the paths of prehistoric migration, from the Levant down to the Nile, from the Sahara toward the Mediterranean coast, and from the Horn of Africa northward. The Nile wasn't just a river, it was a genetic highway. At its northern delta, Egyptian DNA met Mediterranean and Aegean influences. In its southern reaches, it blended with the Nubian and sub-Saharan bloodlines that had followed the water for millennia. To modern scientists, this wasn't chaos, it was balance. Egypt had always been a meeting point, a human equilibrium between continents. The more data they gathered, the clearer it became. The rise of Egypt around 3000 BC wasn't an isolated miracle. It was the culmination of thousands of years of human connectivity. The people who built the pyramids weren't an invented race. They were a continuation of every migration that came before. Even the symbols reflected it. The earliest Egyptian hieroglyphs show boats, waves, and birds in flight. The language of movement. The gods themselves, half human and half animal, embodied the blending of worlds. The concept of Ma'at, balance, harmony, the order of the universe, was not just philosophy. It was the lived experience of a civilization built on diversity. And then came a theory, bold but logical. If DNA from 2600 BC still carried signatures of Mesopotamia, what if the exchange went both ways? Could Egyptian artisans, traders, and thinkers have influenced the East as much as they were influenced by it? Could the architecture of ziggurats, the myths of floods, and the rituals of kingship share a common ancestor older than both? Every new genetic link turned that possibility from fantasy into probability. The civilization within, by the time the research was published, the world had a new way to see itself. History was no longer a collection of separate origins. Mesopotamia here, Egypt there, Indus over the horizon. It was a network, a living organism that evolved through contact, fusion, and memory. The man in the pot became a symbol of that unity, not as a relic, but as a revelation. He proved that identity is not walls or borders, but movement. That humanity has always been migratory, collaborative, and intertwined. Even the physical image of him, dark-skinned, small, strong, weathered by labor, defied modern expectations of kings and conquerors. He was ordinary, and yet he carried the blueprint of civilization itself. Through him, Egypt spoke not as an empire, but as an ancestor. His DNA connected the first potters of the Nile with the first farmers of Mesopotamia, the first herders of the Sahara, the first traders of the Red Sea. His body was the meeting point of worlds, proof that the roots of greatness often lie in ordinary lives. And in that realization, scientists and historians found something quietly profound. Civilization was not a pyramid rising from sand. It was a web, fragile, resilient, and human. The pot that sealed him became the perfect metaphor for our own story. Clay, once soft and formless, hardened by fire, capable of carrying both water and memory. He had spent his life shaping clay, and in death the clay shaped his immortality. Today, his genome sits in digital archives, each sequence preserved like lines of code in a new book of the dead. Not to guide his soul to the afterlife, but to guide ours back to the truth, that we were never separate peoples, never isolated worlds. Only one long migration, looping through time, and returning at last to the man who slept inside the jar. The shadow before history. Every civilization remembers a golden age, a time before the flood, before the kings, before written words carved time into stone. For centuries, historians dismissed those tales as myths. Atlantis, Zep-Tepi, the first time. But when science cracked open the sealed pot of Egypt and read the DNA of a man who lived 5,000 years ago, something strange happened. Those myths started sounding less like fantasy and more like memory. The genome from the potter linked Egypt's beginnings not only to Africa and Mesopotamia, but to a wider, older network. A chain of migrations stretching into deep prehistory. It hinted that before the rise of pharaohs, before the Sumerians built cities in the Mesopotamian plain, human societies were already connected, sharing blood, knowledge, and sky. Archaeology once claimed civilization began around 500 BC, but the sands of Turkey proved otherwise. Atop a remote hill in southeastern Anatolia stands a site older than agriculture itself, Göbekli Tepe. A megalithic temple built around 10,000 BC, when humanity was supposed to be nothing more than wandering hunter-gatherers. Yet its pillars are carved with precision, its architecture mathematical, its alignments astronomical. It predates the pyramids by twice the age of Egypt. Göbekli Tepe's builders disappeared without explanation. No graves, no tools, no written words. But the pottery man's DNA, traced through shared genetic markers, linked indirectly to the same Anatolian, Neolithic bloodlines that populated that region before the site was buried. It meant the people who eventually became Egyptians may have descended, in part, from the same stock that once raised the world's first temples under starlit skies. This wasn't coincidence. It was continuity, genetic and cultural, like a whisper passed from one dawn of civilization to the next. The revelation was subtle but world-shaking. The story of Egypt did not begin on the Nile. It began thousands of years earlier, on forgotten plains, where humans first decided to build something that would outlast them. The survivors of the flood. Every culture speaks of a flood. In the Bible, Noah builds an ark. In Mesopotamia, Utnapishtim survives in a boat. In India, Manu sails through chaos guided by a divine fish. And in Egypt, the ancient priests told of a time called Zep-Tepi, the first time, when gods walked among men before a deluge reset the world. For centuries, these were treated as symbolic stories to explain moral truth, not geological fact. But modern science began finding evidence of massive floods at the end of the last ice age. Floods that fit those ancient descriptions almost perfectly. We now know that between 12,800 and 10,800 years ago, the Earth experienced sudden cataclysms, global temperature spikes, melting ice caps, and sea levels rising over 400 feet. Entire coastlines vanished, rivers changed course, continents drowned. Archaeologist Randall Carlson and geologist Graham Hancock believe that this was the true event behind the flood myths, the memory of a civilization erased by water. They point to melted glass across North America, nanodiamonds in soil layers, and ancient carvings that appear to record the constellation patterns of that era, as if early survivors tried to record what the sky looked like when the world ended. The pottery man's DNA fits perfectly into this theory. His genome carries the legacy of post-cataclysmic survivors, the ones who rebuilt. The genetic mixture of African and Mesopotamian ancestry may represent the merging of displaced peoples who resettled after the deluge, those who carried remnants of older knowledge into new lands. And where would they rebuild first? Near rivers, the arteries of rebirth. The Nile, the Tigris, the Euphrates. Civilizations rose along the same lines where the flood once fell. Egypt's rise around 3000 BC may not have been humanity's first civilization, only its first rebirth. The code of the builders. Archaeologists often wonder why ancient monuments around the world, from the pyramids of Egypt to the ziggurats of Mesopotamia to the step temples of Mesoamerica, share such uncanny similarities. Different continents, different cultures, yet the same obsession with stars, stone, and symmetry. Traditional scholars call it coincidence. Others see something deeper, a shared ancestral memory carried through stories, migrations, and, as we now know, genes. The pottery man's DNA suggested Egypt's founders were not isolated inventors, but inheritors, descendants of builders who already understood mathematics, geometry, and celestial alignment. His genome connects Egypt not only to Anatolia, but to early farming and megalithic societies spread across the Mediterranean basin. Those people built stone circles in Malta, dolmens in Iberia, and sanctuaries across the Levant, all centuries before Egypt's dynasties began. It's as if an ancient knowledge, architectural, astronomical, symbolic, moved with the people themselves. From Göbekli Tepe to the Nile Valley, from the Tigris to the Atlas Mountains, the same geometric principles appear again and again: the triangle, the axis, the sacred ratio. Each culture reinterpreted it, but none invented it from nothing. The Egyptians called this inheritance Hika, the magic of creation, the force that orders chaos. To them, it was divine. To us, it looks like science passed through myth. In the carvings of Göbekli Tepe and the hieroglyphs of Egypt, a similar motif appears: the serpent and the bird. In one, it symbolizes energy and rebirth; in the other, wisdom and vision. Different stories, same code. If the Pottery Man's genome represents the biological bridge between regions, then these symbols are the cultural DNA, proof that humanity carried its memory across epochs. We may have lost the original language of those builders, but their legacy still stands in stone, an unbroken sentence written across continents. The first civilization's ghost modern science is catching up to what myth has always implied, that civilization is older than history remembers and far more fragile than we want to believe. After the DNA revelation, researchers began mapping genetic timelines alongside archaeological ones. Merged populations that appeared in Mesopotamia around 7000 BC were genetically linked to people who lived in the Sahara before it became desert. The same ancestral signatures found in the Pottery Man. It was as if fragments of a once united species had scattered and then reassembled into new nations. Egypt, Sumer, the Indus Valley, the early Chinese dynasties, all rose rapidly, almost suspiciously so, as if guided by inherited blueprints. The myths agree gods, sages, and sky beings descended to teach civilization's arts after a great cataclysm, but perhaps those gods were simply the survivors, the last generation of an earlier world, carrying the technologies and cosmology of a forgotten age. If that sounds impossible, remember in the geological record, the Earth's surface has erased entire epochs before. Every 6,000 to 10,000 years, drastic shifts, magnetic reversals, floods, volcanic winters, reset the balance. And each time, a new chapter begins. The Pottery Man's DNA marks the transition point between two such ages, the memory of catastrophe buried inside the genes of rebirth. To many researchers, this connects the dots between the mythic and the measurable, between the flood survivors of ancient texts and the real genetic migrations that repopulated the earth. Egypt wasn't an isolated miracle. It was the echo of something older, something global. Perhaps that's why its builders looked not inward, but upward. They built monuments aligned with the stars, not to gods in heaven, but to the sky they remembered before the flood, when the constellations looked different and the world was young. The Pottery Man didn't just carry DNA. He carried a memory of the first civilization, one erased by time, but still alive in the rhythm of human creation. Before the pharaohs, before the kings, before the flood, there were builders, nameless, tireless, eternal. Their hands shaped the first stones. Their blood flows in us still. And maybe, just maybe, the man in the pot was one of them, a survivor of a forgotten world who left his truth not in words or temples, but in the code of life itself. The pulse beneath the world beneath our feet, the earth is never still. Its crust floats on molten fire, its poles drift like restless thoughts, and every few millennia something deep inside stirs.